Welcome to the Creative Practice Research Insights podcast. We have an episode today with Professor Craig Batty, who is a Pro Vice Chancellor at College of Creative Arts, Design and Humanities at Adelaide University.
Yep.
Craig has been working in the field of creative practice research for a long time. I can recall seeing really sort of significant keynotes at Mexico conferences and things, and you're also editing two key journals in the field as well. So we're going to talk today largely about how you build a sustainable creative practice research culture within a school or a department. So we're going to kind of take it to a sort of slightly higher level than just individual research projects, and think about at an institutional level the issues around development and leadership. So Craig, first of all, why don't you just do a little self-intro?
Thank you, Roy. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this, and in fact, the whole team here at Nottingham Ningbo to do some workshops today and tomorrow on creative practice research, creative PhDs. Interesting you mentioned, let's take it to a higher level, because something I've just been reflecting on recently is that I've kind of really shifted from doing very specific screenwriting research, I guess project-based kind of research, through to now in a position of looking at more holistically the field of creative practice research. So a lot of my recent work, including a book I'm co-writing and various articles I'm co-writing, because I haven't got much time anymore, is around that kind of, I guess, the meta system of creative research, infrastructure, policy, talent development. So yeah, much more, probably 15 years or so working in this space, but the last probably 5 really looking at creative practice research as a field, less discipline specific and more about research and development, policy, university systems, how they work, how they can embed. So this is really timely. I've gone from screenwriting specifically through to screen production, creative writing, kind of practice-based research, practice research, and really started to find keen interest in creative PhDs, supervising and examining, but also writing about creative PhDs, creative methodologies within PhDs, creative PhD supervision. More and more meta. And I think this topic suits me really well because of that kind of meta view.
So I one of the things that I think you can say about creative practice research now is it's kind of established. When I started teaching, which was a bit over 20 years ago, it was still kind of sort of fighting for a space. And I think what we saw with the work from Prague in UK and last REF, we kind of saw that creative practice research now is accepted, it has a space. And the whole discussion has kind of shifted much more to that meta level, infrastructure and so on, data systems, discoverability and so on. And certainly in my last institution at Southampton Solent University, I was kind of engaged in developing this research culture, and there seemed to be lots of challenges there around even just being able to encourage people to identify as creative practice researchers rather than just creative practitioners, articulate their research. But even then, it's like what are the kind of infrastructural, even in a local institution, department, a school, what are the structures of support and development there? So the first question I have for you though, what are the indicators that a school generally has a creative practice research culture? What would, if we were going to go and look at a hypothetical department and ask that question, what would we be looking at?
Yeah, good question. I think a variety of things. I think one of the key markers would be there's just an understanding of what it is and nobody questions it, and it's just people get on with it. And in particular, people who are not creative practitioners, who identify as practice researchers, also understand it and want to collaborate with the creative practice researchers. So whether it's, I don't know, a filmmaker and a philosopher, or a creative writing scholar and a English literature traditional scholar. So I think those collaborations and looking at research questions, research problems, research challenges at a kind of a holistic level and trying to bring different modes within it, I think there's a really good sign of a strong creative practice research culture. I think also, I think later we might talk about language, but just this idea that there's a language that people share. They don't say, oh, what does that mean? Or, you know, can you explain that bit or define it? It's just, it's become part of the language.
Language often is a kind of real signifier of community, isn't it? Or a community of practice.
Yeah, like a vernacular. And I think as well, and this does involve, well, A, it involves investment, and B, it requires higher level people to be involved right at the top, whether it's Deputy Vice Chancellor Research or whatever, is that it needs to be written into policies, procedures, documents, so that, you know, it's not always left out or added on as an attachment. Something I'll mention a bit later in the talk I'm giving is, even now you do still get people saying, oh, we understand it, but then they quickly slip into the, oh, it's engagement work, or it's kind of illustrating the real research. And I think that
or it's
starts to
method for the real research.
And it starts to kind of, I guess, undermine. So I think that holistic understanding, which it takes time to get there, but it needs to be written into the walls. And so people just live it and breathe it and celebrate it, really.
So what distinguishes a mature ecosystem from a collection of isolated projects? So if I was to look at Southampton Solent University in the Film and Media Department, you could see lots of people doing stuff, and there was definitely some really good projects going on. But for me, I couldn't really see a research culture. So what would distinguish those two?
Yeah, and as we mentioned before, a little twist of fate here. I started my academic career at Southampton Solent University. In fact, I studied there before that, and that's when I started to become interested in practice research, and I could see the same things. And some people were doing it, but most people weren't. I think. Look, there's a few, I guess, big ticket items here I'm going to talk about. One is, and this is a longer term gain, which links to having the right leadership, whether it's at the faculty level or even at the whole university level, is having the right people in the right roles to be able to identify people who are or who can be creative practice researchers, and bringing them into the school, the department, the faculty, whatever it is. Because often when we think about teaching and learning students, they go, oh, this person's got a great profile, they used to do this, this, and this. That'll bring in the students. Looks good in a brochure, but it can often be at odds with building a research culture, because it's not, I mean, these days you have got lots of people who've got PhDs and deep industry experience. The pool is bigger than it was even 5 years ago, really. But I think sometimes people can be, you can cut people off at the pass really early on, or employ the, in inverted commas, the wrong people, which I know they're not the wrong people, but a different profile of people that can really just make building a research culture a non-starter. And the other thing I think which links to this, and it does link to the kind of people you perhaps employ at the beginning, but it also links to what you do with these people as soon as you get them into the university system, is thinking about who are the people who can think critically, conceptually, think like a researcher. People often use the word research, or I did my research for this article I wrote for a magazine, because I'm a journalist, for example, but that's quite different to, I don't know, long-form investigative journalism, which might be more akin to kind of capital R research. So I think shifting people who are not researchers into to that high level of thinking, and not just kind of doing things to brief, industry briefs, I think is a really key point.
Mm-hmm.
And that would involve, and I've seen this a lot and had most of my PhD students over the years have been industry people coming in, is putting them through PhD programs and really starting to crack open their ways of thinking so they think differently as a researcher. So I think there's something about the way that researchers think at a kind of higher order thinking kind of paradigm that you don't often get when you just necessarily pull someone in from industry who's got particular skills. So I think there's something about the workforce
I've always felt that there was a challenge about around recreating a new identity for people. So I've kind of mentored a lot of practitioners who've come in to teach, and they bring a lot of value, but getting them to make a shift to thinking themselves as researchers and academics rather than just practitioners, it can be quite a long-term challenge.
Yeah, it can be. And even within that, and you still see this a lot, I have to say, unfortunately, but people who are practice-based researchers, creative practice researchers who only want to do creative research outputs, but they don't want to write in scholarly ways about their practice. And I just think, you know, to your question around a sign of a really mature culture, I think when you've got this ecosystem of not just people collaborating and working with each other across projects and challenges, etc., research challenges, but also creative practice researchers who write creative works, they make films, they design, whatever the practice is, dancing, singing, whatever, but they're also reflecting on or writing scholarly works that talk about it. And I think that is, if we want to talk about an ideal model, people who can kind of shift modes between the creative material practice but also the scholarly writing practice, which can still be creative. It doesn't have to be dry and traditional. I think that's a really good place to aim towards.
I think there are a couple of really good exemplars of where that kind of starts to really work for creative practice research, and I think Screenworks and Sightlines are two great examples. And I've been doing some work with the International Journal of Creative Media Research to kind of open that out to other areas of practice as well. And this idea that you actually are not only articulating the research themes, but you're actually extending the research through this kind of process of articulation and speaking about it, and then a kind of a peer review process. So I think that there are opportunities to work around that, even at a kind of, well, you don't necessarily need to write a whole scholarly article, but you can still be working within those systems and kind of developing those articulation skills, because in a way, my understanding is that one of the criteria that makes creative practice research is the dissemination and the sharing. And so if you're only making the content and you're not engaging in the sharing and the dissemination of the research, you're only doing part of the job.
Yeah, because it's contributing to knowledge in the creative work, but also then articulating what that knowledge is and what the contribution it is in textual forms, which everybody can understand, well, most people, whereas if it's in the creative work, not everyone will have language to understand. If it was something like fashion and the way that, I don't know, a particular garment has been stitched or woven or whatever, I wouldn't know whether that's a research contribution, whereas someone would from that field. But if you write about it and explain it in quite explicit ways, you do. It's also a pedagogic piece, and again, goes to your point about a really strong, healthy culture that you can build within a department or a school. Is that kind of that dialogue, whether it's written or spoken. I was involved in Sightlines when it first came into being, and one of the early decisions we made, which I think is the same as Screenworks, is we decided to publish the peer reviews anonymously, but also the responses and the responses back. Not everyone does that, but because to be able to read the thinking process and how a reviewer reviews someone's articulation of research and then their response to the review of it is actually a really good pedagogy.
Yeah.
So it's that kind. You can replicate that in seminars.
Well, this is the. Hopefully, there's an article coming out on this very shortly, and that's exactly what we've done, and kind of looked at replicating that and making all that dialogue apparent and transparent, because it feels like it's that dialogue where the really interesting stuff starts to kind of sort of distill from the research. And I found it, I kind of acted as a sort of self-pilot, and I found it really, really useful.
Autopilot.
Yeah, it was. So let's have a brief chat about pinch points and structural challenges. Where do institutions typically struggle when embedding creative practice research?
Well, I mean, I mentioned before things like policy and frameworks and documents and things that need to exist to show that the university is invested in it is one thing. But then beyond that, there's often there can be a infrastructural issue with how things are captured, made visible, discoverability you mentioned earlier, even to things like the internal peer review or verification process of how do you put the work into the research repository? Who looks at it? How does someone peer review it? How is feedback given? Where does it get hosted? That is a huge thing that no one's really been able to crack, and in particular how that could be then shown to the outside world. That's I think that's a real pinch point. And again, it comes back to leadership. It comes back to having, whether it's the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research or the Vice Chancellor or whatever, understanding the importance of something and investing, and often that includes financial investment.
Yeah.
I think that's a big pinch point.
There's been there's a big project called Enact happening that I think it's Leeds and Westminster, and one of the interests, it's AHRC funded, and it's being led by some people, academics at Leeds, who are kind of musicians, composers essentially, but they're partnering with library services people, and it's all about this idea of data infrastructure. So metadata, DOIs or equivalents, because if I do creative practice research, I don't really have that. And that idea of how do you deposit? The example I'd like to give is I put on an opera in the back of a pub. How do I get that peer reviewed? How do I establish it as correct practice? Where do I post it? How do you kind of represent that in a depository? So I think these are questions that Enact are kind of working on. And they've only just started, so I think there's kind of going to be interesting material. Whether they'll crack it or not, I don't know, because they have an idea to create a national data repository, and that feels very ambitious. Yeah,
we were talking with various people in Australia about doing something similar, but again, it's huge ambitious. It will cost millions to build. Our idea was that as well as having it available to the work, it would actually also be like a national peer review system, where, because obviously it's got to be peer reviewed or verified that it actually is research and it's passed certain thresholds around, quality assurance, etc. But that is a huge thing. But another point which links to this, which is where I think cracking it, to what happens to this stuff beyond this system, which is a pinch point for universities, a lot of universities, not all, is how does that then feed data sets and things like rankings? It's all good and well that you've put on an opera at the back of a pub, and yes, we'll accept that it's research because it was research thing about pubs and whatever, live music venue, literature and all of that, or live opera venues. But who's going to cite it? How is that going to stack up against a Q1 journal article? And some people go, oh, it's better we don't put it, because it actually might dilute the collection and then all of a sudden QS rankings. Whereas other universities that are perhaps more innovative and think much longer term might think, well, are those rankings going to change in the future? And what really matters? And, so I think there's something about we've almost created this, we as in the higher education sector, we've almost created like a self-serving ecosystem, cottage industry that it's like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I guess we do have to look at it and think, I mean, don't get me wrong, there are great things about the systems and they tell you a lot, but have we almost created this Frankenstein's monster where the actual intent of what it was meant to do, the research that is perhaps at odds with how we're now gaming the system? And, you know, some vice chancellors or deputy vice chancellors of research are very aware of that and want to play the game. Some are very aware of it and don't want to play the game, but then there's a payoff if they don't play the game in terms of rankings. International student recruitment is often based on rankings, so it's pretty... And yet universities are there to connect with, serve communities and the public. So how does that... It's very
And also
complex.
that opera in the back of the pub is it's like a small audience, it's kind of low budget compared to the opera that I staged at the Barbican, which was very high profile and had lots of press reviews in the Guardian. And so you can see, well, there's two sort of benchmarks of quality there that are very, very different. And yet my opera in the back of the pub might have had clearer research articulation and been more influential in terms of research. So how that benchmarking is still kind of very at odds with what's going on and where we want to be, perhaps.
See, from the Barbican to the bar, just had to get that one in there. But it also comes down to the research question. Like, if the research question or exploration or proposition was something quite specific about small venues or pubs or community or a particular city or town, then that venue, if you like, is perfect for that thing. Whereas the Barbican, it might look better on paper, but it might be that the research underpinning it was perhaps that wasn't the best venue. So, and are people assessing it at the Barbican? Are they assessing it as research or as top-end creative practice? It's quite complex.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just to wrap up that particular area, what shifts have you seen that make the biggest difference? What's the one thing that someone could do to really shift the debate and the position and the kind of culture?
I guess, look, I was in my previous job, which is actually kind of the same. It's the same university, but we've just merged. So we're a different university, Adelaide. A merging of two universities, University of South Australia and University of Adelaide. I previously worked at the University of South Australia, so that was only up until I don't know, December the 19th or something last year. So it's the same thing. Well, it's not the same. It's new. I shouldn't say that. Actually, I shouldn't say that. But one thing we had at UniSA, University of South Australia, which and I began my role there as Dean of Research before stepping into Executive Dean role, was that we had such a strong advocate in our Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research. And what she did from the very beginning was she sponsored a project where we did some mapping and scoping of best practice around creative research, capturing, evidencing, repositories, etc. Then she sponsored this follow-up, which is where we got the library, the business intelligence, the IT, all the team leaders across the university came together. We created this platform for the university, and it was just backed from that high level. There was 7 academic units or faculties in that university, and everyone had a Dean of Research, and so every Dean of Research was involved in this work just to get that real strong buy-in, and so that everyone understood it, and so they could go back to allied health or business or engineering and talk about creative research or non-traditional research outputs, as we often call them in Australia. And so I think that kind of backing, and then it even went down to the level of requiring that when major bids went in for these particular schemes that they run in Australia, there had to be at least 3 kind of faculties or units involved, and actually not demanding, but almost demanding that the humanities and creative were put into it. So like,
Okay,
and that was
yeah.
a kind of, I guess, well, not ideological per se, but or a philosophical position that, and actually it worked. And so
Right.
then you started to see these grants going in with designers and storytellers on, and they were getting up. And so I feel like that leadership and that belief in that the world of creative research, and then this person was also on these national bodies and advisory bodies around research, etc. So was able to then champion it at a national level, and I think it is like hen's teeth finding those people, but I think we need them because
Yeah.
the people do the same for engineering or health or business. So so I feel like it's that kind of leadership is probably the biggest success because it filters down into
I
everything.
certainly think from my experience of working in these kinds of institutions that are, someone described it at universities as hyper-complex,
Yes.
chaotic institutions, and you can't really push from below. You can try and you can achieve little things, but you do need that high-level leadership. That's my experience. Okay, final couple of questions. Let's talk about that shared language and building confidence around creative practice research. You mentioned it earlier, and I'm sure when you do your talk later, you're going to talk a bit about this. How do we develop? Is there a language? Is there an emerging language, or are we still? Have we given up this argument about the 100 different ways of describing creative practice research, for example?
Yeah, and I'll be talking about that in our thing a bit later. I would like to think that we have and or should. I mean, I like yourself, I like to use the terminology creative practice research because I do think it's broad enough to encapsulate not only different disciplines, but also different modes or different branches,
different
flavors.
Yeah.
So I like to talk about that. I mean, some people don't like it. Some people just prefer practice research. Some people just prefer the word research, actually. So I think we are still having those debates. But I think a lot of it is because people are not necessarily reading widely and understanding the literature and understanding the different takes on it or the different nuances. And I know this is extra work for everybody, but I think, like a good scholar, just kind of keeping on top of who's talking about things, whether it's published or whether it's video essays or whatever, and just starting to understand the nuances, I think is really important because it means when you come to have conversations or if you're writing about this topic, you well, obviously you're more informed, but you're more confident and you can actually cohere people and start to... So I feel like, and you see this often in PhDs, they might write a couple of paragraphs at the least, or maybe a whole chapter on methodology, creative practice research or practice-based research, but sometimes they only use maybe 2 or 3 references and it's quite tokenistic.
Okay.
And I just think, almost like an off-the-shelf, like you would with, thematic analysis or interviews. There's a couple of well-known people who get cited all the time. It's like an off-the-shelf. I'm not sure we're at the stage with this where we can do that yet. Okay. So I feel like we need to get better at that PhD level as well, to kind of think through a little bit more carefully. And my desire would be that eventually we talk about creative practice research as this field, and then within that you identify the particular disciplines, modes, materiality, etc. But that's just me saying that. That doesn't mean everyone's going to agree. And also not being afraid to, if you're in a seminar, for example, or a training session or whatever around this, just question it or just ask for unpacking, or what do you mean by, when you say, I don't know, research findings, what do you actually mean by findings? Because sometimes we use words like data, findings, methods, and I think sometimes we use them haphazardly and don't quite, we're not interrogated on, on my research findings about, what do you mean the findings? Can you just point to, in the film, for example, where would I see the findings of the research? Can you just give me some concrete examples? So again, it's this learning process. Some people swing the opposite way and will say, oh, it's different. Creative research is so different. We don't have data. We don't have. Well, actually, we do.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's.
I think we do, and I think that's actually encouraging people to capture the data as they go through the project is one of the things that I've seen in my own practice, is kind of trying to improve that process of capture as you're making things, because otherwise you come to the end of it and you go, oh, I can't remember how that happened or what happened here, or
Yeah. And look at another thing, it's about shared language, you might want to edit this out, but I feel like we also need to get better at calling out BS. I'll just say that because I'm not sure who's listening. Like, I've been in so many workshops over the years where people talk about the practice research, and sometimes it's just so generic and vague. It sounds really convincing. Like, oh, it's an exploration of this. I'm interested in this. I wanted to tease out this. I thought about but it can sound quite, oh, there must be a genius. But often it's quite, there's nothing concrete underneath it.
Yeah.
And so I think we just need to get better at just calling it out. A colleague and I, we've published actually quite a bit together. I'm not going to name her. You can probably look it up and work it out who it is. But we were in a workshop at a former university that I used to work at, where she works still, maybe 8-9 years ago. And it was great. It was a great workshop, and there was all of this kind of exploratory discussions going on, and we just thought some of it was a little bit ridiculous. So we had to do a little presentation about how we'd use these found objects to explore something. So we just literally made it up. And so when it came to us, we was using all the buzzwords. This is this, and the angle of the toilet brush handle is a proposition about this. We deliberately put the sheet of paper underneath the walnut in order to suggest, and people actually believed us.
Right, okay. Yeah,
and I just thought, oh my God.
Yeah.
Until we started laughing, and then they realised we were taking the piss. But so I just think, whilst I really love all this kind of conceptual philosophy, sometimes we just got to go, is this just smoke and mirrors? And that, I think, does us a disservice, because some people hear that or read that and they don't get it, and they just say, well, look at those people.
Is this perhaps brings us back to the role of peer review, isn't it? I mean, isn't that, and that's something that I've kept kind of bumping up against when I write a paper and submit it to a journal. It gets peer reviewed, and that's a kind of a dialogue, but it's also a benchmark of academic rigor and standards, and we don't really have that in place in the creative practice research, and it feels to me, if peer review is important to scholarship, is that something that we really want to build for creative practice research?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we talk about peer review and its equivalence, because it might sometimes be post hoc. So it might be that something is reviewed or written about in particular ways after the work is out there, which so that's not technically being peer reviewed, although a version of peer review may have happened. But so it's a little bit more complex. But I actually think there needs to be, exactly right, there needs to be quality markers. There needs to be I don't want to use the word gatekeeping, although I just did, but there's got to be something that shows that it's gone through some process of a peer, whoever that is, or some invitation, or something that's shown a quality, because otherwise anybody could do anything.
Yeah. Especially with AI now,
oh my gosh, yeah. Let's not get AI to peer review. That would be.
Spark that. So I'm going to wrap up now, because it's a really interesting conversation. I'm sure we could spend a lot of time here, and you're here in Ningbo for a couple of days, and we're going to be having a lot of these conversations, because I think for us, it would be recognised within the department. We've got these new creative practice PhDs, and there is an opportunity to kind of really grow and build a research culture here. So what would you like to say that you haven't said so far?
Oh gosh, that's like opening a can of worms. Well, I guess let's just end on a positive. Like, there's so much that the creative practice researcher can do within a university ecosystem, and not just within the university, but university with industry, with community, with partners, whoever. I just think there's something about, and this links to the book that Smiljana Glizovic and I are just finishing at the minute. There's something inherent and innate about the way that creative practitioner researchers think and do that is just, it can draw more audiences to work and to thinking. It can spark new ideas. It can do different things, and I just feel that we haven't fully realised the important role a creative practice researcher can play in a university, even if it's a comprehensive university that has everything from creative writing through to medical school, whatever. Like, in all of those things, and I just think, we talk about, in some areas, they talk about, they bring on methodologists who might be a particular data skills or particular analytical skills that they're bringing into a kind of a big group project. Well, why can't the creative practice researcher be one of those as well, who can bring a particular methodology, a particular sensibility to a project, so that every big project, even if it was something to do with actuarial science, looking at insurance algorithms, there must be something in that a creative person to take their discipline there into a whole new realm. So that's, I think, celebrating the role that the creative practice researcher plays within the university and more broadly is something we really need to do more work on.
Great. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Craig.
Thank you.
And see you all next time.